It wasn't love that pulled you toward them, it was gravity. Not the soft gravity of affection, the dark gravity of the psyche, the pull of something buried in you, calling out to something buried in them. You thought you were choosing freely. You weren't. You were orbiting. Carl Jung warned us of this long before neuroscience caught up. He wrote that the unconscious is not passive. It chooses for us. It binds us. It organizes fate itself. What you called falling in love may have been your shadow seeking recognition, your wounds seeking their mirror. Because what feels like destiny often isn't love, it's compensation. Because what feels like chemistry often isn't soul, it's survival. Because what feels irresistible is often the psyche reenacting a pattern you've never dared to confront. I will show you tonight that your most intoxicating relationships are not accidents of romance, but reenactments of unresolved archetypes. Jung called them complexes, clusters of memory and emotion living underground, directing you like puppet strings. When two complexes lock together, the sensation is overwhelming. You call it attraction. He called it possession. They see you and call it fate. They sense you and swear it's soul connection. They feel you and insist it's love. But what's actually happening is far stranger. Two psyches colliding in mutual projection, each mistaking recognition of their own wounds for intimacy with another. Think of the woman who always finds herself with men who belittle her. Think of the man who always falls for partners who abandon him. These are not coincidences. These are gravitational pulls of the unconscious, repeating until they are made conscious. Jung's most terrifying observation was simple. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is why so many of your most passionate attachments feel both magnetic and destructive. They weren't built on choice. They were built on gravity. And gravity doesn't ask permission. Now, here is the paradox I promised to unravel for you. What you thought was the deepest form of love was often the deepest form of repetition. And yet, within that very repetition lies the possibility of transformation. Because gravity is not destiny, it is a summons, and what summons you can either consume you or complete you. Let me take you into Jung's clinic in Zurich, where he faced a case that still reverberates like a warning bell. A young woman, brilliant and beautiful, came to him weeping. She swore she had met her soulmate, a man who, in her words, completed her spirit. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think. Every thought circled back to him. She called it love. Jung called it danger. Why? Because he recognized the symptoms. He saw not love but possession, not destiny but repetition. She was describing what he named a complex, a knot of old experiences and emotions that acts like a second personality. In her case, it was the abandonment complex. Her father had left when she was young. The wound had never healed. Decades later, her psyche was still searching for the missing figure. So when she met this man, her unconscious cried out, "There he is!" But it wasn't him. It was her father's absence projected onto his face. This wasn't intimacy, this was gravity. And gravity doesn't care if it destroys you. Jung recorded how quickly her life collapsed. She left her work. She alienated her friends. She sabotaged every boundary she had. Her entire identity was consumed by the orbit of this one man. And here is the most chilling part. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't manipulative. He wasn't even extraordinary. He was simply available. And her unconscious did the rest. This, Jung wrote, is the most dangerous illusion of all, when projection is mistaken for love. It is not that the other person is malicious. It is that the relationship is built on an archetypal script that neither partner fully understands. Because when you project, you don't see them, you see yourself, and because you see yourself, you cannot let go. The young woman's suffering forced Jung to articulate a truth we still resist. The most intense experiences of falling in love are often not encounters with another soul, but collisions with our own shadow. He called this the anima-animus projection, the inner masculine or feminine we carry, thrown onto another person, making them appear godlike, irreplaceable, destined. Jung observed this in case after case, where men and women destroyed themselves, chasing an image that was never real. Here is the sentence that cut through his patient's illusions. You do not love him. You love the part of yourself you have never met. Think about that. How many times have you sworn someone was the missing piece of your heart? How many times did it end in collapse? That collapse wasn't failure, it was revelation. Because the unconscious will keep sending you the same face until you turn around and meet the figure inside you. The young woman eventually understood. Slowly, painfully, she began the work of individuation, separating her inner father from the man she obsessed over. It nearly broke her. But on the other side, she discovered something extraordinary, the capacity to love without compulsion. And that is the promise hidden inside the gravity of obsession. What begins as possession can become integration if you dare to see it. Where did you learn to call gravity love? Where did you inherit the idea that the one who shakes your world must be your soulmate? You didn't invent this myth, you absorbed it. Fairy tales taught you that the missing half would appear one day to complete you. Culture reinforced it with endless songs, novels, and films. And beneath those stories lies something more ancient. Plato's myth of the split soul, two beings torn apart, doomed to search until reunion. It sounds romantic, it feels eternal, but Jung would call it projection disguised as destiny. Why? Because the missing half you seek is not another person. It is the unlived part of your own psyche. Jung wrote that what you call fate is often the meeting with yourself, under the guise of another. Because what feels like reunion with another is often reunion with what you exiled. Because what feels like divine completion is often psychological compensation. Because what feels like soulmate is often soul shadow. This is why the myth is so dangerous. It encourages you to look outward for what must be resolved inward. It trains you to idolize intensity and call it love, when intensity is often a sign of projection at work. Jung saw this repeatedly in his patients. Men convinced they had met their eternal goddess, women convinced they had found their savior. The early days burned with ecstasy. Then came collapse. Why? Because no human can carry the weight of an archetype forever. The goddess will forget to text back. The savior will leave dishes in the sink. And when they do, the illusion shatters, and the fall is catastrophic. Jung named this process inflation, followed by deflation. The psyche inflates the other with archetypal energy, godlike perfection, and then collapses into despair when reality intrudes. This wasn't love, this was theater, not intimacy, projection, not soulmate, complex. But don't misunderstand. Jung never said that projection makes love false. He said projection makes love dangerous, because projection blinds you, while conscious love reveals you. And here is the trap. The more you cling to the soulmate myth, the more you will cycle through obsession, disappointment, and despair. Each new partner will seem to carry the answer until their humanity cracks the spell. Then you will call it betrayal. But it was only ever inevitability. The task, Jung insisted, is not to banish projection, it is impossible, but to recognize it. To say, this fire I feel is not proof that they are divine, it is proof that I am encountering my own soul through them. And when you can say that, the myth dissolves into something truer. Not a soulmate sent to complete you, but a mirror sent to reveal you. That is why the soulmate myth, left unconscious, is a psychological trap. But made conscious, it becomes a doorway. How do you know if you're in love with them, or only with your own projection onto them? Jung gave us clues, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Symptom 1. The feeling of inevitability. You meet, and it feels as though the universe conspired to arrange it. Not because it truly did, but because your unconscious has been rehearsing this meeting for years. The complex recognizes its counterpart instantly and whispers, "Finally." Symptom 2, time distortion. Days feel like lifetimes. Hours of silence feel unbearable. You collapse the ordinary flow of time into obsession because your psyche is convinced that survival depends on this bond. Symptom 3, boundary erosion. You compromise faster than you think. You silence your needs, abandon your hobbies, stretch your values. You mistake this collapse for intimacy when it is actually self-betrayal. Jung warned, the greater the projection, the weaker the boundary. Symptom 4, endless rumination. Every word, every glance, every pause becomes evidence. You replay their messages as though decoding scripture. Why? Because what you're actually trying to interpret is not them. It is the archetype you have placed upon them. Symptom 5, agonizing withdrawal. When they pull away, you feel not ordinary sadness, but existential panic, as though your very being is dissolving. That terror isn't about them leaving. It is about your unconscious confronting the abyss of its own unmet need. They see, they sense, they feel. But what they see, sense, and feel is not you. It is their own denied qualities thrown onto your canvas. Jung called this the dangerous gift of projection. Dangerous because it seduces you into believing you have found your other half, when you have only encountered your own shadow in costume. Because the psyche will not rest until it completes itself. Therefore it lures you into situations that mirror its wounds. Because the unconscious seeks integration, therefore it disguises compulsion as destiny. If you recognize these symptoms, understand, you are not cursed. You are being invited to stop mistaking your own unlived life for another's divine presence. And yet, simply naming the symptoms isn't enough. We must see the types, the predictable masks projection wears. For unless you know your type, you will confuse your wound for your calling. If you've ever found yourself chasing someone who would not stay, you weren't simply desperate. You were embodying one of the chaser archetypes, patterns Jung saw again and again in his patients. Each has its own script, its own wound, its own way of mistaking projection for love. Type 1, the rescuer. You believe that if you heal their wounds, they will stay. Every argument becomes a mission. Every tear becomes proof of your duty. Jung observed that rescuers are driven by their own denied need for healing. Because they cannot admit their own fragility, they rush to fix it in others. Therefore, they chase endlessly, confusing servitude with intimacy. Type 2, the prover. You perform, you excel, you display achievement as bait. If you can be flawless enough, perhaps they will choose you. Jung noted this in patients who had grown up under impossible expectations. They carried the inner commandment, earn love or lose it. The chase becomes a performance review, not a relationship. Type 3, the vanisher. You pursue, but the moment closeness arrives, you disappear. You text at midnight, then ghost in daylight. You ache for intimacy, but sabotage it when it gets real. Jung linked this to unresolved fear of engulfment, the unconscious conviction that closeness will dissolve your identity. Because you cannot tolerate both intimacy and selfhood, therefore you cycle between craving and fleeing. Type 4, the mystic. You sanctify the chase. Every sign becomes divine confirmation. Every rejection is read as spiritual trial. The relationship becomes prophecy. Jung warned that the mystic archetype mistakes archetypal energy for destiny. They are not seeing the person. They are seeing their own anima or animus cloaked in another's body. Here is the cruel irony. Each archetype believes they are moving toward love, but in truth, they are running away from themselves. The rescuer flees their own wound. The prover flees their own unworthiness. The vanisher flees their own fear of self-loss. The mystic flees their own inner God image. Because each archetype protects against a wound, therefore, each archetype guarantees repetition. And repetition is gravity's cruelest trick. You circle the same orbit again and again, convinced it is progress, when in truth it is compulsion. Jung saw this cycle as both tragic and necessary. Tragic because it destroys illusions of love. Necessary because only by naming your archetype can you begin to break the orbit. But what gives the orbit such force? Why does chasing feel so holy, so intoxicating, so inevitable? Jung pointed us to the hidden machinery behind it all, the shadow. Why does the chase feel divine? Why does obsession masquerade as sacred calling? Jung gave us the answer, the shadow. The shadow is not just your darkness. It is every quality you disowned, your power, your anger, your clarity, even your capacity for boundaries. Qualities too threatening to your early life were pushed underground. But the psyche doesn't discard them, it seeks them, and it seeks them through others. So when you meet someone who carries your denied traits, they don't feel like a stranger, they feel like salvation. Because you disowned strength, therefore you worship theirs. Because you rejected anger, therefore you crave their fire. Because you silenced your wisdom, therefore you sanctify their words. Jung called this the danger of projection. What you cannot own in yourself, you will idolize in another. This is why chasing feels holy. You're not chasing them. You're chasing the parts of yourself you buried. The other person becomes a walking reliquary of your lost soul. Every look, every smile, every absence strikes like lightning because you sense that through them something essential might return to you. But here lies the distortion. The beloved is not your savior. They are your mirror. They show you what you have not yet claimed. This is why the energy is so intoxicating. Projection doesn't just light up romance. It electrifies the nervous system, convincing you that without them, you are incomplete. The intensity is not proof of destiny. It is proof of disconnection from yourself. And here is the paradox Jung revealed. Projection is both the trap and the doorway. It enslaves you in obsession, and yet it points you precisely toward what you must integrate. The chase feels holy, not because they are divine, but because your shadow is divine. And until you reclaim it, you will keep mistaking gravity for God. Now that we see the mechanism, the question sharpens. How do you reclaim what you've projected? How do you retrieve the power without destroying yourself in the orbit? Jung gave us a sequence, a process that interrupts compulsion and restores choice. Jung warned that projection cannot be ended by willpower. You cannot simply command yourself to stop chasing. Why? Because projection is not conscious, it is automatic. But what you can do is retrieve what you have given away. This is the retrieval sequence, the movement from compulsion to choice. Phase A, interrupt. You must first stop feeding the gravitational pull. Jung told his patients, do not battle the image, withdraw from it. This means a romantic fast, 14 days minimum, no checking their messages, no stalking their feeds, no rehearsing conversations in your mind. Why? Because every repetition strengthens the orbit, withdrawal weakens it. Because silence feels unbearable, therefore silence is the medicine. Phase B, reclaim. Once the orbit weakens, you turn the question inward. What do they carry for me? If you crave their strength, where in your life are you refusing your own? If you ache for their affection, where have you withheld love from yourself? If you idolize their certainty, where have you silenced your own knowing? Jung called this the art of owning the projection, taking back the qualities you had cast into another's shadow. Phase C, rewire. The psyche needs new patterns to stabilize. Replace every act of chasing with an act of self-respect. Instead of composing the perfect text, write the page of your book. Instead of scanning their stories, train your body until you sweat. Instead of imagining their approval, enact one boundary you've avoided. Because your nervous system must feel safety before it can release obsession, therefore you must embody safety daily. Phase D, reframe. You begin to reinterpret the intensity not as proof of destiny, but as proof of shadow. Every pang of longing becomes a signal. This is what I must reclaim in myself. You stop asking, why don't they love me? And start asking, What part of me have I exiled onto them? And then something extraordinary happens. The orbit breaks, the gravity weakens. You feel the first taste of sovereignty, the ability to desire without compulsion. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming whole enough to choose love rather than be possessed by it. But choice without boundaries collapses back into theater. The retrieval sequence frees you from the orbit. Now you must learn to broadcast your wholeness, and that requires boundaries, not as walls, but as signals. Most people misunderstand boundaries. They think boundaries are walls, ways of keeping people out. Jung saw them differently. He called boundaries a declaration of the self, a way of saying, this is who I am, this is where I end, this is what I allow. A boundary is not rejection, it is revelation. Think of it as a broadcast, not a barricade. When you say, I move at the speed of reciprocity, you're not punishing anyone, you're announcing the tempo of your soul. When you declare, I don't negotiate my non-negotiables, you're not closing doors, you're opening only the right ones. Because without boundaries, desire becomes compulsion. Therefore, with boundaries, desire becomes choice. Jung observed this repeatedly. When patients who once chased compulsively learned to state their standards calmly, the entire relational field changed. Some people recoiled, unable to tolerate the new clarity. Others adjusted, calibrating to meet them at eye level. The response itself was diagnostic. And here lies the secret. True soulmates calibrate. Entanglements escalate. When someone respects your boundaries, you glimpse the possibility of authentic connection. When they resist, mock, or punish your boundaries, you're seeing the shadow at work, projection trying to keep you in orbit. Boundaries are the psychological immune system. They don't attack, they identify. They separate self from non-self. And in doing so, they protect vitality. This is why Jung insisted that individuation requires the courage to stand alone, not to isolate yourself, but to announce yourself. Because only when you declare your territory can you discover who truly belongs within it. And once you hold this stance, something new emerges, magnetism. Not the gravity of compulsion, but the radiance of sovereignty. Jung described it as the natural attraction of wholeness, truth, time, and territory, aligning into a signal others can feel. If projection is gravity, magnetism is sovereignty. Gravity drags you. Magnetism draws others without effort. Jung hinted at this difference in his writings on individuation. Once a person becomes whole, they attract not by chasing, but by radiating. That radiance rests on three pillars, the magnetism triad. Truth, not the truth you recite to please others, the truth you live when no one is watching. Jung said the greatest privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When your outer life aligns with your inner nature, people feel it before you speak. Truth has frequency, and it cannot be faked. Time. Projection burns fast. It demands instant certainty. Magnetism breathes slowly. It allows compatibility to reveal itself across days, weeks, seasons. Jung warned that impatience is often the unconscious trying to force repetition. By honoring time, you break the spell of compulsion. Because you no longer need immediate answers, therefore, you become impossible to manipulate. Territory. This is the architecture of your life, the habits, friendships, and commitments that exist with or without a partner. Jung observed that those who have not built their own territory are most vulnerable to possession. Territory makes you sovereign. It tells others, you are welcome to join my world, but I will not abandon it to orbit yours. Because truth roots you, time stabilizes you, and territory protects you. Therefore, magnetism arises, not from effort, but from alignment. And here is the paradox. When you embody the magnetism triad, you no longer need to chase. But because you no longer chase, those who are meant for you can finally find you. This is why Jung insisted individuation is not isolation, it is preparation. You do not become whole to avoid love. You become whole so that love can meet you as an equal, not as a captor. The triad does more than attract partners. It filters them. The ones who belong will resonate. The ones who don't will vanish, without drama, without collapse, without the old cycles of obsession and despair. And to live the triad, you must anchor it in practice, rituals that stabilize truth, protect time, and expand territory. Otherwise, magnetism flickers. Magnetism isn't theory, it's lived. Jung insisted that individuation must be embodied in daily practice, otherwise it dissolves back into fantasy. The psyche needs ritual containers, structures that stabilize truth, protect time, and preserve territory. Here are the rituals that transform magnetism from idea into presence. Daily projection retrieval. 10 minutes each day ask, what part of myself did I give away today? If you envied someone's boldness, write, that boldness is mine. If you longed for someone's affection, write, that capacity is mine. Because projection never stops, therefore retrieval must never stop. Daily, one act of self-respect. This can be as small as saying no without apology, or as large as completing the work you've avoided. Jung believed the psyche strengthens by repetition. One act a day rewires the nervous system to recognize your own authority. Weekly, the solo covenant. One appointment you never cancel, an hour devoted to your own expansion, a class, a hike, a creation. Jung warned that people who abandon solitude abandon themselves. Your weekly covenant becomes the anchor of territory. Weekly circle audit. List the people who add vitality and those who drain it. Jung described psychological economy, the conscious management of energy. Each week, act on your audit. Invest more in those who amplify you, less in those who erode you. Relational, the first 90 days rule. Jung taught patience in individuation. Apply it to connection. No instant fusion, no collapsing timelines. 90 days minimum before naming destiny. This honors time as a diagnostic. Those aligned will pace with you. Those driven by compulsion will reveal themselves. These rituals are not punishments. They are signals. Each one says, I am whole, I am sovereign, I am ready to be met, not consumed. Because rituals discipline the unconscious, therefore magnetism stabilizes. Because magnetism stabilizes, therefore projection loses its grip. And yet, even with rituals in place, you will face resistance. Gravity does not vanish quietly. It tests you with trials, each designed to pull you back into orbit. Jung saw these trials in every transformation. 3 in particular appear without fail. No one escapes the trials. Jung observed that when someone breaks free from projection, the unconscious retaliates. It tests your resolve, probing for weakness. These trials are not punishments. They are initiations. Trial 1. The echo. The past returns wearing a better mask. The ex reappears, reformed and repentant. The new lover feels strangely familiar, promising everything the last one denied. It feels like redemption, but it's rehearsal. Jung wrote, what you resist not only persists, but grows in size. The echo is the psyche's attempt to lure you back into repetition. Because you've withdrawn, therefore the pattern intensifies its call. The cure? Wait. Observe. Give it weeks, not hours. Echoes collapse under time. Trial 2. The desert. After the echo fades, you encounter emptiness. No attraction, no spark, just silence. Jung knew this as the nigredo, the blackening. The psyche rests in apparent lifelessness, while new structures form underground. Most mistake this for failure. They panic and go back to chasing. But the desert is sacred. It teaches you to live without compulsion, to anchor in selfhood before magnetism returns. Trial 3. The mirror. When you finally meet someone stable, the terror begins. Not because they hurt you, but because they don't. You feel exposed, seen. Their steadiness triggers every hidden fear. What if I'm not enough? What if intimacy consumes me? What if safety is the trap? Jung saw this in countless patients, the terror of being loved without chaos. Because projection has ended, therefore the real work begins, allowing yourself to be known. These 3 trials are universal. You may think you're exempt, but if you're walking this path, they will come. The echo will test your discernment. The desert will test your endurance. The mirror will test your capacity for intimacy. Pass them, and the psyche shifts. You stop chasing illusions. You begin discerning reality. And discernment is the threshold. It is the line between chemistry and connection, between projection and love. To cross it, you must learn to measure the difference. The trials strip you bare, but once you stand on the other side, you need discernment, or you will fall again. Jung insisted that love must be tested, not merely felt. Projection is intoxicating, connection is steady. Here is the checklist to separate the two. 1. Chemistry spikes, connection sustains. Chemistry is fireworks, loud, sudden, unstable. Connection is a hearth, warm, enduring, alive day after day. Because fireworks burn fast, therefore they fade. Because fire in the hearth burns slow, therefore it nourishes. 2. Secrecy versus visibility. Chemistry hides. You keep it in the shadows, afraid others will break the spell. Connection welcomes sunlight. Friends, family, community can witness it without collapse. Jung warned that what must be hidden is often fueled by the unconscious, not by truth. 3. Nervous system clues. Chemistry agitates. You wait by the phone, sick with longing. Your heart races at absence. Connection grounds. You feel settled, alive, breathing deeper when they are near. Because agitation feels like passion, therefore many mistake it for love. But peace is the truer sign. 4. Trajectory. Chemistry consumes your world but shrinks your life. Hobbies fade, friendships suffer, focus collapses, connection expands. You grow braver, more creative, more yourself. Jung observed that real love enlarges the personality. False love depletes it. 5. Illusion versus integration. Chemistry is fueled by projection. You see only what you want. Connection integrates. You see flaws clearly, yet stay because truth outweighs fantasy. Jung wrote, "The meeting of 2 personalities is like the contact of 2 chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The key is whether the transformation deepens you or depletes you. Because projection blinds, therefore discernment reveals. Because chemistry deceives, therefore connection sustains." With this checklist, you stop calling obsession love. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop selling your soul for the price of excitement. But discernment alone is not enough. You must have standards. Standards without consequences are only wishes. Jung knew that individuation requires choice, and choice requires the courage to lose what is false. Discernment without standards is paralysis. You can see the truth, but if you cannot act on it, you remain enslaved. Jung insisted individuation requires decision, drawing lines that define the self. A standard is not a preference. It is a law of your psyche, and a law without consequence is only decoration. Non-negotiables, honesty, reciprocity, emotional availability, shared vision. Without these, there is no foundation, because without honesty, trust collapses, because without reciprocity, giving rots into resentment, because without availability, you become a ghost's caretaker, because without vision, you wander in circles. Consequences. If dishonesty repeats, you leave. If effort is one-sided, you withdraw. If they cannot meet you emotionally, you stop trying to carry both souls. If values diverge, you choose alignment over attachment. This is not cruelty, this is clarity. Jung warned against what he called inflation, the tendency to imagine that love alone could redeem dysfunction. It cannot. Standards protect against inflation. They anchor love in reality. Because you are willing to lose the wrong person, therefore, you become eligible for the right one. Because you enforce consequence, therefore, your psyche trusts itself again. Patients who fail to enforce standards returned to the same orbit again and again. Those who did enforce them began to experience something rare, relationships grounded not in projection, but in authenticity. Here lies the paradox. By risking loss, you gain love. By accepting solitude, you make room for soul. And this brings us full circle to the paradox we began with. It was never love that pulled you down. It was gravity. But now, with standards enforced, you can step out of orbit and into conscious attraction. We began with a dangerous illusion. You thought it was love. It was gravity, the unconscious pulling you into orbit, repeating the same story until you broke. Now you see the pattern, the soulmate myth, the symptoms of projection, the chaser archetypes, the shadow disguised as holiness, the retrieval sequence, boundaries as broadcast, the magnetism triad, the rituals, the trials, the discernment, the standards. The path was never about chasing. It was about signaling. Chasing says, complete me. Signaling says, I am complete and I invite alignment. Chasing drains. Signaling attracts. Chasing confuses chemistry with love. Signaling discerns connection from compulsion. Chasing repeats gravity. Signaling radiates sovereignty. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the slow, painful birth of the self. Not half a soul seeking its other half, but a whole soul broadcasting its wholeness. The danger was never that you loved too deeply. The danger was that you mistook projection for love and gravity for destiny. Now you know better. Because you can see, therefore you can choose. Because you can choose, therefore you can love. So I leave you with the challenge Jung left all of us. Stop asking who will complete you. Start asking what within you waits to be reclaimed. And when you reclaim it, broadcast it, not through force, not through chase, but through presence. The paradox dissolves. What once enslaved you becomes your signal. The orbit becomes magnetism. The wound becomes wisdom. The danger isn't that you want love too much. The danger is failing to form a conscious relationship with the power of wanting. Use it as medicine, as signal, as cultural leverage. Stop chasing, start signaling, and in doing so, become part of what's next.